A 21-year-old man has to fill a form and he will simply write Mr. Rakesh Zaveri. Let's say that's what his name is. He doesn't have to think twice about anything else. A woman has to fill a form. 3 choices are given to her before she writes her name: Miss, Mrs., Ms. Why does a man only have to write Mr.? And why is it a woman has got 3 choices? Well, it's pretty much obvious. It's for the same reason that in a form, when your identification has to be given, you have to write your father's name or your husband's name if you are a woman for your identification. This is so in most cases. If you're a man, you're expected to give your father's name. In some cases, they ask you for spouse. It's true that now things are changing, thankfully. However, if you look at most traditional forms and their identification, where you have to identify yourself, you are supposed to give your father's name. Very rarely is there a choice given father oblique mother. It could be simple. Why is it not given? Why don't they just write parent's name? Why is it that only these choices are given? Well, we are a patriarchal society, and wherever there is patriarchy dominated, you will be asked to identify with the help of your father or your husband, wherever in the world these societies are there. Okay, and the world is mostly dominated by patriarchy. Now, why am I discussing this? Because language is shaping consciousness as much as consciousness is shaping language. Instead of using the word consciousness, let's just talk about mindset, because these are just mindset. You have a certain patriarchal mindset, so you will be given these questions. Whether a man may be married, unmarried, divorced, widower, Mr. is enough. A woman has to choose. Now, what happens when we use language in a certain way? We shape the mind. Now, think about it. For 10th grade, a child has to fill his form. He has to write his father's name or her father's name. What happens when the child is brought up only by the mother and the father has nominal or no role to play in the child's life? Why is it that the simple choices are not given in most forms? Now, I know things are changing, thankfully. However, mostly you still find this. Why don't they just simply write Mr. oblique Ms. and wherever marital status is relevant, you ask separately identify what is your marital status. For identification of a parent, why don't they just write parent's name or father oblique mother? Why is that not given? How is it that how blindly these forms are printed? Nobody asks, nobody in the government asks, nobody in the private sector questions. It's yes, a few players in the private sector, a few people are asking and their forms have changed. But largely, take a look. I don't even have to fish them out. Take a look. Largely, you will find that this is the case. Now, what we are trying to understand is how language shapes the mind. Okay, it's very, very interesting. It's a massive, long topic. I'm going to dwell a little bit on it. Now, have you ever considered why whenever there's a figure of authority, we don't call them by first names per se? We don't just say this name, okay, and then address them, because you want to keep a little distance. Now, how do you create a distance? Through names, through language, through titles. Okay, if you just called everybody by the same name, of course, like in some Western societies, they will call everybody by the first name. But there are subtler ways. You will not use the first name, you will say Miss so-and-so, Mr. so-and-so. That means that there is a difference. Whereas when you're on first name terms, that means there is a certain familiarity. Again, language is being used and how names are being used in order to create a distance. In India, we use first names, but we will always, well, not always, but mostly we will attach something. They will say, okay, and they will say, Manmeet, uncle. Uncle is used because you don't want to call any stranger by any other name. So you have these filial terms. Everybody is an uncle in India. Okay. Now what happens when you want to call a boss? you will say sir or madam, or you will use Mr., or in India you could say bhaiya, chacha, whatever. Okay, why is this so? Because first name means familiarity, and at sometimes you want a distance, you want boundaries. So, how is language used to understand and create boundaries? What kind of language do we use when we are addressing people, and how do we create space, or how do we crash space, and how do we break ice? If you look at Hindi, for instance, when you're addressing somebody, there are many ways of addressing. You can say aap, tum, tu. If you're referring, aap aiye, tum aao, tu aaja. Okay. Whereas in English, you only have you. Even if you want to express respect, you don't have the bifurcation of something. You can't say aap, tum, and tu. There's that fine difference is not there. It's always you. The difference has to come through your tone. Okay. In a lot of Indian languages, you have these separators that are there. But in English, interestingly, there is that you. Okay. Of course, whether this is the only way to create space or separation or distance, that's not true. But we are looking at how language is so instrumental in creating certain kind of spaces, especially when it comes to names. Would you call anybody by their first name? Well, if it's a stranger, you want to use something safer. You don't want to sound very familiar. You don't want to sound absolutely familiar. So we use generic terms, bhabhi, didi, auntie, uncle, tau, chacha, whatever. You go anywhere in India, you find these filial terms. Anybody who is going in the train with you is bhau, betho, whatever. Okay, so this is how these terms are used. So language, and right now we are only using how we address people. Okay, how do we address? We don't call our parents by their first name. Most people don't call their parents by their first name. There's an automatic respect because they are your parents. Whether this is so, whether just by calling them mummy or papa or bauji or whatever, father, mother, whatever you call your parent, do you genuinely respect? Maybe, may not be. We are not going into how, but what we are going into how, we are not saying that language is the only way. The way you use a person's name is the only way to create distance of familiarity, but it is definitely one strong way. So it's really interesting when we address people. You would not call your parents oye, but you do it to your brother or sister, especially if it's a younger brother and sister. You say, "Oye, give me that." You would not normally use that kind of tone for your parents. Of course, the tone is being used over here. But language, the way we address people is interesting. How do you create space? How do you melt space? Just by the way you utter somebody's name and how you call them is interesting. What language you use, especially if you are in multilingual societies. In India, everybody speaks almost 3 to 4 languages or 6 languages or more languages. So sometimes we use a different language when we are addressing a different person. Very often you are talking in the office and you're saying something which is very formal. I find that in India people switch to English, whereas when they're saying something less formal, they'll switch to a local language, whatever language they are speaking, Tamil or Telugu or Hindi or whatever. So what language do you use, and how do you use it, and especially how do you address a person? The use of a certain title to create a certain aura or to help to propagate a certain mindset is something that is worth thinking about.